Yes, good morning. Welcome to this rainy Friday morning. What a way to end off the last Friday of this school year. Our time is definitely winding down together. Um, we will finish this unit today on life in the ancient regime prior to the French Revolution, which burdens me in here with the fact that we will not have had reviewed the 19th century, which is the century we just finished in the third quarter. Um, we did totally in the third quarter up to 1914. Um, so I hope that you will all forgive me, although, basically my review was we just went over everything again. I won't do anything but finish this unit today because you have that review test that's going to take you quite a while. In fact, if you want to, put a pause on this, do the review, and come back and listen to me tomorrow. Why don't we get started? Finish this test. Finish this unit. And here we go. You should have pulled up by now Roman numeral 19 from your study guide. 18th century under the old regime. Beginning with 19, the agricultural and industrial revolutions eventually reduced the role of women in the workforce. And that reduction will not recover until the 20th century. And once again, forgive me. Once again, if by some circumstance the subject matter of your question for the DBQ is women's history, which I doubt because women's history was a subject of an LEQ some 2-3 years ago. But if, you never know. If it is, keep in mind the most important incident that forwarded the cause of women towards equality was World War II. Because, you just can't say it's World War II, because during World War II, all the males, the great majority of the males, were shipped off fighting the war, and women were then pressed into service working in what were then considered man-only jobs. And when the war was over, the women were like, hey, we're not going back to the kitchen. It is worth noting that, yes, all of the Allies in World War II put women into the workforce. However, the Germans didn't. The Germans utilized slave labor, which really was not dependable in such a circumstance. Women, very dependable. Okay. Women had been very important before the agricultural revolution in the old system of agriculture. Machines operated by men more and more displaced women in the workforce. The mechanization of the textile industry did leave many women without one of their most traditional means of earning income. In other words, when they added machinery to the textile manufacturing, and this is even in the smaller scales, it was considered that women are not smart enough to run these machines, so go cook dinner. The mechanization, many women often turn to alternatives to gain employment. Some turn to the cottage industries, meaning things that they did with their hands in their homes that, of course, were considerably less profitable. And yes, some turned to prostitution. And thousands became domestic servants, to the point that, this is worth noting, during the 19th century, the biggest employer, the biggest employer of female labor was domestic service, becoming a maid or a cook or some sort of function within a family's household. Domestic service. The shift in female employment yielded several key results. Women's work became associated with the home. I remember growing up saying that. That's women's work, rather than places where men work that had, male status to it. The assumption grew that women could only do certain types of simple home cottage type work. And it was assumed also that women only worked to supplement a spouse's income. And of course, women were paid less than men when they did enter the workforce. Roman numeral 20, let's talk about demographics again. Now, demographics, that could be a subject, population growth. That could be a subject for a DBQ. I mean, this is driving me nuts. I really will be mad if they simply, for this upcoming DBQ, have some isolated incident. It just won't be fair. Isolated incident. Oh, yes, you're supposed to learn the whole thing, but come on, let's be real. Some people may focus on that one thing. Other people may, run through it. And if in the old way, the DBQ, if you ask about Otto von Bismarck, but you also then have an LEQ about something else, and then you have, of course, your multiple choice questions that cover a wide range of subject. Then you have your short answer questions. That's okay, but I just got to believe that if they're going to ask one question, it's going to be a question that is widespread, that covers a lot of territory. One subject matter, but covers a long spread. And so population growth could be. Cities grew rapidly and geometrically. That means in size. They grew quickly and they grew bigger and bigger during this era. In 1500, there were 156 cities in Europe with a population of 10,000 or more. And of those, only Paris, Milan, Venice, and Naples had larger populations than 100,000. 300 years later, 363 European cities had populations of 10,000 or more, and 17 had populations of 100,000. The percentage of Europeans living in urban areas shifted from just over 5% to just over 9%. But during the 19th century, that is going to go from 9% to above 50%. The majority of European population now lived in Northern Europe rather than around the Mediterranean. I mean, when we first began studying this course, more people lived around the Mediterranean because the climate was better. Then Northern Europe experienced a population surge because the business was better. London grew from around 700,000 in 1700 to almost 1 million by 1800 to 2 million by 1850. Paris had more than 500,000 by the French Revolution, and Berlin tripled, reaching 170,000 in 1800. Forgive me. Even in France and Britain, though, most people still live in the countryside. Probably less than 20% lived in the cities. The major urban development of the 16th century had been followed by a leveling off and even a decline in the 17th century. So, major urban development of the 16th century had been followed by a leveling off and even a decline in the 17th century. The cities that experienced the greatest growth were the capitals and ports. That reflects the growing importance, of course, of trade with the New World, because those seaports on the northern coast of Europe were the major benefactors, receivers of the benefits of all that raw material, sugar, et cetera, coming in from the New World. Except for Manchester and England, and Lyon in France. The new urban conglomerates were non-industrial cities in the 18th century. Manchester was becoming an industrial city rapidly on, and Lyon, but all the others, the growth was not yet tied to industry. Rural labor was cheaper than urban labor, with cities with concentrations of labor decline as production was moved from the urban workshops into the country. New cities outpaced older, larger ones in terms of rate of growth. Improved agricultural production promoted the growth of nearby market towns and other urban centers that served agriculture or allowed more prosperous farmers to have access to consumer goods and services as they desired. In other words, the cities that grew were the ones that basically, it's kind of like our meat packing plants today. They receive the cattle from the countryside and they turn them into meat products. And so the towns were like that. They received the agricultural products from the countryside and they collected them, packaged them, and shipped them out. Roman 21. The lines of distinction between the classes developed in the cities just as in rural areas. The nobles and the upper class lived in fashionable homes, often surrounded by green space, green squares that would separate them from the underclass. To be real honest, you see the same thing today in cities. The rich neighborhoods have some kind of a geographic barrier between the rich neighborhoods and the poor neighborhoods. For one thing, you won't see sidewalks that go from the poorest neighborhoods right into the rich neighborhoods. The zoners just don't do that. For one thing, it would run down property values. To be honest, if you've ever been to Park Hills borders Covington, but between Park Hills, which is a suburban type upper class neighborhood, and Covington, which is a working class, lower class neighborhood, there's a very steep hill. There's no sidewalks that directly take you there. And that's not an accident. That's not a coincidence. And I'm off the subject, forgive me. The poorest town dwellers often congregated by the rivers. Why? Because nobody else wanted to live there. Sanitation, of course, was a constant problem by the river because the river would go up and go down. That's a problem. And of course, in those days before the advance of modern sewage system, sewage ran in these specifically built drainage ditches that bordered the buildings. And guess where they ran? They ran downhill, they ran towards the river, and that's where the poor lived. Poverty was worse in the countryside, but more visible in the urban areas because it was more, concentrated. And of course, you had crime, prostitution, vagrancy, begging, alcoholism, et cetera, all together. Cities were also home to public executions and punishments. And at the top of the urban social structure was a small group of nobles, the large bankers, the merchants, financiers, clergy, and government officials. The most dynamic, the movers and shakers in the cities and the urban areas were the middle class. During the 18th century, this is going to change in the 19th century, but during the 18th century, the middle class, they're agitators. Middle class had less wealth than nobles, but more than the artisans and skilled laborers. They saw themselves as a worker class, and they looked upon the nobility as useless. The middle class normally supported reform, change, and economic growth. The middle class might not enjoy all the creature comforts of the extremely wealthy, but they could enjoy some. And because they could read and write and think, were often a thorn in the side of the upper classes. the power clashes of the 18th century normally involved issues of power and sharing power, not values associated with the class. Part E, the artisans were skilled workers who often found themselves at the mercy. These are people who worked with their hands. I mean, they were skilled, but they worked with their hands. I mean, for example, the famous fishwomen, the poissons of Paris. They're artisans because they were skilled at taking these giant tuna fish and turning them into cuts of fish that could be bought and sold. And yet, they were also subject to the forces of market, the market, just like any other businessman. As it says there, who found themselves at the mercy of economic forces that were far beyond their control. The price of bread, for example. And they were the largest group in any cities. Like the peasants, these people were mostly conservative. I mean, that's a strange thing. The working poor are a conservative group. Change would normally benefit them, but they are worried that change will also bring hardship and they would lose what they have. The primary organization for these people was the guild. The guild, what we'd call a trade union or a labor union. The guild has, however, waned in power, dropped in power since the medieval days. Oh, I spelled medieval wrong. Before E. Yeah. Medieval days, but they were still not to be ignored. Roman numeral 23. The artisan class was given to if its sensibilities were offending to rioting. And the most common reason for rioting was the price of bread. If a baker increased his prices too high, a riot might ensue, and the baker might find himself strung up. Remember, there are no police force in the cities. Bread riots were not irrational acts of starving peasants, but often choreographed works of some cause. Rioters were not riffraff, but normally wage earners and freemen who wanted some sort of justice. The fact that, in fact, the crowd of the 18th century was often a tool of the upper classes. And this will come out in the French Revolution, that the mob will be subject that will be used by the king, but more so by the bourgeoisie to get what they want. Anyway, Roman numeral 24. Let us talk about Jews again. Also, could be a topic, or religious toleration could be a topic because it spans centuries. Roman 24. Although there were Jewish enclaves in the Netherlands and England, most Jews lived in Eastern Europe. There were Jewish enclaves in the Netherlands and in England because those two places did allow Jews some sense of dignity and equality, particularly in the Netherlands. The Netherlands, remember, was the first country to give Jews full citizenship. All right, but most Jews lived in Eastern Europe, with Russia having the most Jews. The Jewish population of Europe was concentrated in Poland, Lithuania, and the Ukraine, where no fewer than 3 million Jews lived. Catherine the Great, the enlightened despot, specifically said no Jews allowed, excluded Jews from a manifesto welcoming foreigners to Russia, but no Jews. Jews dwelled in most nations without enjoying the rights and privileges of citizenship, kind of on the fringe of society. No matter where they dwelled, Jews lived in distinct communities where they were secluded from non-Jews. Jews lived in these areas. Some of these areas, these ghettos, as they were called, were self-governing, walled off. In others, they lived under the stigma of discrimination from their government, having to wear the yellow star, et cetera, et cetera. Only England allowed Jews to mix with the mainstream. This period, which may have begun with the Spanish expulsion of Jews, is called the Age of the Ghetto. in that period of time, basically from um, well, from the Spanish Inquisition of the 15th century to the 18th century. Some Jews were wealthy enough to finance rulers, meaning to loan them money. And because they loaned them money, these rulers kept Jews. They gave them a place in court where they could be used as advisors and borrow money. And they were called court Jews. Perhaps the most famous was Samuel Oppenheimer, who helped the Habsburgs by loaning them money in their struggle against the Turks. However, many of these court Jews were often unpaid for their loans. Yeah. And of course, when the Jews objected, oftentimes the attitude was, well, you are Jewish. But the majority of Jews, and this will be true all the way through World War II and beyond, the majority of Jews in Europe lived in poverty. Largely because of discrimination, largely because Jews were simply not allowed to engage in the normal occupational pursuits that other people did. Jews lived in the undesirable sections of the city or the poor rural villages. They pursued money lending if they could get into that. I mean, not everybody's going to just, oh, I'm going to be a banker. You can't do that. You have to have some money to begin with. They pursued money lending when they could, but most often worked in the lowest rungs of the labor ladder. I mean, kind of like a permanent underclass. Until the last 2 decades of the 18th century, Jews who retained their religion were subjected to various civil, meaning laws. They couldn't do certain things, couldn't participate in certain things. Religious, of course, and social disabilities. They were regarded as both socially and religiously inferior. And Jews could be required to listen to sermons that were insulting to their sensibilities. Remember, I told you about Rick Steve on visiting a Jewish ghetto in Italy. And Italy is where the word ghetto originates. And it originates as a place where Jews lived. That they lived in a walled, very crowded ghetto, lowest place in elevation in the whole city. And that at the end, there were 2 gates in the walled ghetto. And sitting right in front of the ghetto, there would be a Christian Roman Catholic church. And there would be instructions in Hebrew, in Yiddish, on how a Jew could convert from being Jewish to being Roman Catholic. And Jews who left the ghetto to go to work every day had to walk right past that. And so, yeah. And that completes that unit for us. I am going to leave you now because you have that test, which takes 50 minutes. And, good luck on that. And I will also put in your Canvas, I'll also put a notification, or rather a copy of the French Revolution unit. And so, yeah. Okay. It's time for me to go. Happy weekend. Good luck to everyone. Let me use this hand because I'm clicking out. I do want to end